Welcome to the very first episode of The Road To. In this series, we're going to look at games that feature a collection of characters and examine the journey in each game that the characters went through to all end up in the same game together. In our first season, the game we're going to look at is the 1999 Nintendo 64 hit Super Smash Bros. Well, in this first season, we're going to focus primarily on Nintendo characters. As we move forward with other games and other Smash games as well, we're going to be looking at characters from different companies and different genres. So, along the way, I intend to give you some video game history and backstory of what's going on in these time frames outside of just Nintendo. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the first episode of The Road to Super Smash Bros. In this episode, we're going to see the very first two characters that Nintendo would introduce to us: Donkey Kong and Super Mario. These two characters would become so iconic that when they first put Nintendo characters into the Super Smash Bros. Series, out of the first four placed in, these were two of them. But before we get started with that, let's take a look at the early history of video games. Our story is going to start in the 1960s, before video games yet existed. Computers were extremely rare, they were large, they were expensive, and nobody had them in their homes, but you might be able to find them on a university campus. And in fact, that's what happens here, as some students at MIT had the opportunity and access to a computer and realized they could program it to play games. And so they did. They created a game called Space War. And a guy named Nolan Bushnell had the opportunity to play Space War and realized the potential that it had. And so in 1969, he constructed his own version, a game he called Computer Space. He attached the game to a television screen, and he put a shell around it that required quarters to play it. The arcade cabinet was born. In 1972, he founded the company Atari, and soon thereafter, he hit the jackpot with the arcade game Pong. The arcade was off and running. Meanwhile, in the home market, in 1966, a guy named Ralph Baer had an idea to play games on the television. He developed what he called the brown box. He wished to sell it for $20, and so he introduced it to electronics companies. Magnavox liked it and decided to license the box from Baer. The Magnavox Odyssey and the first generation of video consoles was born in September of 1972. Some first generation consoles lacked color, although later it would be added. Some lacked sound. Some lacked the ability to keep score. Most required two players because there was no CPU. Most importantly, the systems lacked quality graphics and did not have the ability to produce sprites. And the games were pre-programmed onto the system. If you wanted a new game, you had to buy an entire new system. The Odyssey hid this limitation as the system only turned on by inserting a card into the system. The cards activated the game code, and you could buy additional cards that would activate codes that were already programmed as well. The Odyssey would begin being sold in Japan in 1974, but it was discontinued in 1975, with new editions to be introduced by Philips, who purchased Magnavox in 1974. In all, 8 different consoles were released before the end of 1977. Also in 1975, Atari would release a home version of the Pong console. Coleco got involved in the systems in 1976. Between 76 and 78, Coleco released 14 different Telstar models. The Telstar dominated the gaming market because the system sold for just $50, half the price of their rival companies. In November of 1976, Fairchild released the Channel F. This new system was the first of the second generation consoles. It featured the ability to display one sprite and, most importantly, cartridges. The gaming market would forever be changed. Meanwhile, in Japan, on June 1st, 1977, Nintendo would get involved in video games. Nintendo debuted nearly 90 years earlier as a playing card company, and just a few years earlier had got into the toy market. And they saw a need for video games in Japan, and so they started developing their own version of first generation consoles. Between 1977 and 1980, Nintendo would release 5 color TV games. Japan lagged behind in the video game market, though, as they were still on the first generation. The US was continuing to advance with a new second generation console. Atari would release the VCS, or as it better became known, the 2600, in September of 1977. This system was a big step up from the Channel F and would come to dominate the second generation. In October, Fairchild would release the Channel F in Japan. It was the only second generation console in the country until 1982. In December of 1978, Magnavox released their newest version, their second generation console, the Odyssey 2, in Europe, and it would make its way to the US in February of 1979. Mattel decided to join the video game market and released the Intellivision by the end of 1979. In 1980, Nintendo developed a handheld line. Game developer Gunpei Yokoi saw a man playing with an LCD calculator on a train one day. Yokoi got the idea that they could make games with this technology, and the Game & Watch was born. Handhelds tend to be one generation behind the consoles, and this is certainly no exception. Well, the second generation is moving forward. These early games lacked color, although Nintendo manipulated the colors in different fashions to produce elements that looked like they had color. They did have sound, but each device had just one game. They were able to create sprites, but the characters were only able to go to pre-programmed locations. The first title, Ball, came out April 28th, 1980. With all of those precursors out of the way, our story is going to begin in July 1981. So in addition to working on home consoles, Nintendo was developing arcade games, and had been since 1978. For their newest game, Gunpei Yokoi was assigned to oversee Shigeru Miyamoto as he designed his very first game. Originally, the game was developed as a Popeye game, but Nintendo failed to get the license. So Miyamoto continued on with the idea, but created original characters, and with it, he created not one, but 2 of Nintendo's most iconic franchises. Miyamoto did not work in a traditional fashion. He developed a storyline and worked the game around it. He asked the designers to create 4 levels, while most arcade games only had 1. He developed a game that required climbing and jumping from the main character, and it defined the platformer genre. Meanwhile, Nintendo wanted to have success in the American market and wanted an American name. Miyamoto decided to name the game after the enemy, the monkey, because he was the strongest character in the game. And so the name Donkey Kong was born. Donkey Kong was released on July 9th in Japan and July 31st in the US. While the monkey had a name, the game's hero was simply titled Jumpman, and the damsel in distress was called Lady. Eventually, the characters would receive the names Mario and Pauline, although many gamers thought the woman was Princess Peach, because for many of them, the first time they ever saw it was the NES game that came out after the release of Super Mario Bros. Eventually, the backstory provided that a carpenter named Mario had a girlfriend named Pauline and a pet monkey named Donkey Kong. Mario mistreated the ape, and Donkey Kong, in a fit of rage, kidnaps Pauline. This is where the game begins. We see Donkey Kong scale a newly constructed building and jumps up and down in anger, causing the beams to bend and form their now famous shape. Mario must scale ladders and barrels that are hurled from Donkey Kong on his way to the top. After reaching the top, a heart appears, but Donkey Kong grabs Pauline and heads up the ladder as Mario's heart breaks. A cutscene then shows Donkey Kong asking, "How high can you go?" In the next stage, we see Mario trying to maneuver on conveyor belts while trying to avoid contact with cement pans. As in the first level, he can grab a hammer and destroy any enemies, but is unable to climb the ladder until the hammer runs out. This is also the first stage where he can begin collecting items that Pauline has dropped. Once again, Donkey Kong climbs away as Mario reaches the top. The third stage is reminiscent of the first, but now has elevators to traverse and springs to avoid. In the final stage, Mario must pull out rivets from the beams while avoiding fireballs. After pulling out the final rivet, the beams crash to the ground. So does Donkey Kong, and Mario is reunited with Pauline. This effectively ends the game as it completes the storyline, but to work as an arcade, it needed to continue on, and so they offer a point system and start you back at the beginning. Ultimately, the end goal that they want is not to complete the story, but to score as many points as you possibly can. The game proved to be a great success and began to put Nintendo on the map in the United States, and gave 2 great characters to build their company around. Our story continues June 3rd, 1982, nearly a year later. Nintendo would put these 2 characters on a version of their Game & Watch. The game would be called Donkey Kong. The game was released as a multi-screen model. The console folds in half and can be opened and played across 2 screens. The game features a single action button, but in order to allow players to move up, down, left, and right, Nintendo put in a directional pad. It was the first time ever using this technology and would come to define what a controller should look like. The lower screen represents the first level of the arcade game. Mario must run across the construction site and hurdle barrels thrown from the top screen by Donkey Kong. The challenge in this game is that low-hanging girders prevent Mario from jumping in certain locations, so he must be quick to get to places where he's able to jump. He then climbs a ladder to get to the top screen while still avoiding barrels. This is where the game gets a unique spin. Mario must hit a lever to set a chain in motion while still avoiding barrels. Mario must time his leap to grab a chain. At the top, Mario removes this chain, holding the girder that Donkey Kong is standing on. After accomplishing this, Mario gets started back at the beginning and must work his way all the way to the top all over again. He has to do this 4 times, removing all 4 chains before the girder Donkey Kong is standing on falls to the ground. Just like the arcade game, once Donkey Kong has fallen to the ground, it starts right back over, and the goal is to get the highest score possible. This is in order to encourage repeat gaming. Meanwhile, Coleco, who is in the video game market, as mentioned earlier, started building very similar LCD tabletop series of arcade games, so designed to look like a miniature arcade. And this miniature arcade actually does a good job of duplicating the original arcade game. It only has 2 levels. The game duplicates the first level fairly accurately. Mario must climb up ladders while avoiding barrels hurled by Donkey Kong. The second level looks identical to the first, but this time the barrels now have fire on top of them, and the movement now matches that of the fireballs in the original arcade game. The mechanics for this level have changed as well. It's not about running up to the top, but now if you walk over certain spaces of the floor, the space will be removed. It acts just like the rivets in the original arcade game. For an early handheld port, it's remarkable actually how close Coleco was able to get it to the actual arcade game. Nintendo wasn't done with these characters either. In August of 1982, Shigeru Miyamoto and Nintendo released a sequel to Donkey Kong called Donkey Kong Jr. The game picks up where the last one left off. Mario now has Donkey Kong locked in a cage while the gamer controls Donkey Kong Jr. as he tries to get his father released. Again, the game is 4 stages, some of which are earned by advancing in levels. And again, the game offers points to encourage gamers to keep playing even after rescuing Donkey Kong. This game features more climbing and less jumping as you are playing as the monkey this time. The game begins with a cutscene in which 2 Marios, maybe the first appearance of Luigi, are bringing Donkey Kong's cage into place. In the first stage, Junior must navigate across vines and platforms while avoiding Snapjaws in order to collect a key. In the second stage, he must avoid birds as he navigates higher in the sky and then across some chains to grab another key. In the third stage, he runs across platforms while leaping over sparks and climbing higher until he retrieves the next key. In the final stage, Junior must avoid Snapjaws and birds while pushing 6 keys up the chains and into place. As each key is put in place, Donkey Kong's cage begins to disappear. After the last key is locked in place, DK falls to the ground to be caught by Junior. A final cutscene shows the duo go off screen as Mario gives chase. Just as Mario is to leave the screen, we see DK's foot kick Mario back across the screen. The game then resets with a higher difficulty. Donkey Kong Jr. didn't mark any significant advancements for Nintendo, but provided a fun alternative to the original while keeping many of the story elements and stylings the same. It was quickly becoming clear that Nintendo was here to stay. They had 2 characters on their hands, Donkey Kong and Mario. Now they hadn't been split up yet, they soon would be. But they still had more to do together, which we'll find out about next time when we look at the rest of 1982 in Nintendo's journey. Also, one more note about Super Smash Bros. The very first stage of Donkey Kong is used in the first Super Smash Bros. Game as a training level for both Donkey Kong and Mario, as it has become an iconic stage. So tune in next week, guys, as we continue to look and continue to move forward with the road to Super Smash Bros.